This is the second in a series of videos on counting, or combinatorics, and in this video specifically what we want to do is we want to look at some notation that we're going to use in the future. And specifically the notation we want to look at first are factorial notation. And we use it like this. Let's go 5 with an exclamation mark. And the way we say that is 5. Now 5 factorial, that's the way we read this, 5 factorial, that's just simply equal to 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And then you just multiply these out. That's 20, 60, 120. And if it was 4 factorial, it would be 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, which would be 24. 9 factorial would be 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And at that point we see that we probably would like to know how to do that on a calculator. Though all calculators are different, all of them should have a button that looks like this. Sometimes you have a button which is called PRB, and the exclamation mark will be under the PRB. On a graphing calculator it's pretty straightforward, just type in a 9. And what you want to look at is you want to look for your button that says Math. And after you hit Math, you go over here to PRB and hit it in, and then you go down until you see an exclamation mark. So you have 9 factorial, that's 362,880. The other notation that we'd like to look at is we'd look at some notation that has that's usually written NCR or NPR. These are just two formulae that you want to memorize. So NPR is going to be defined as n factorial over n minus r factorial, and then NCR is going to be defined as n factorial over r factorial n minus r factorial. So they're very similar. The difference is NPR doesn't have an extra term, where NCR has an extra term right here. And just let's do this real quick. Let's do 7p3, and that's the way we actually say this. We go 7p3, and that's 7 factorial over 7 minus 3 factorial, or 4 factorial. And then usually there's this button on a calculator, but for simple ones you can do it kind of in your head, because 7 factorial is 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And 4 factorial is 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And if you notice here, the 4 cancels with the 4, the 3 with the 3, the 2 with the 2, and the 1 with the 1. So these cancel and these cancel, and you end up with the problem of just 7 times 6 times 5, which I can almost do in my head, 30 to 10. NCR, let's look at an example of that one. If you look at NCR, let's choose 5C2. 5C2 would be 5 factorial over 2 factorial, and then 5 minus 2 factorial, which is 3 factorial. Now this is 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. This is 2 times 1 times 3 times 2 times 1. So it's exactly the same as the NPR, except for you have an additional term here. You can still cancel. The 3 cancels with the 3, the 2 with the 2, and the 1 with the 1. And you end up with 5 times 4 over 2 times 1, which is 20 over 2, or 10. And if you notice, the NCR will always be less than the NPR. Now you can also do these on a calculator, and again, if you do those on a calculator, it depends on where it's going to be. Sometimes you'll see a button which is NCR and NPR directly on your calculator itself, and sometimes you need to look under a button that says PRB. PRB stands for probability. With a graphing calculator, you look under Math. So let's do this. Let's do 7C5 on a graphing calculator. So what you're going to do here is you're going to first type in a 7. Then you're going to hit the Math button. When you hit the Math button, you have a menu, and you're going to go over to PRB. And when you go over to PRB, you're going to have a menu here, and you have one which is NPR or NCR, and you choose whichever one you want. In this case, we want NCR, so you go right down to NCR and push Enter, and then you push a 5, and it's 21. And it turns out it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not you do this with a calculator or without a calculator. You need to be able to do both. So what do we need to worry about here? One thing is make sure you understand the algebra here. If you have 11 factorial over 3 factorial, 8 factorial, that looks like a hard problem, but it's really not. Because if you look at this right here, 11 factorial, 8 factorial, that's going to simplify to simply 11 times 10 times 9 on the top. And then you have the 3, which is a 3 times 2 times 1. Now, if you look at that, the 3 and the 9 cancel. That becomes a 1 and that becomes a 3. Then all of a sudden this becomes pretty doable. 11 times 10 is 110 divided by 3 is 330 divided by 2. Or I think that that's going to be 165. And here's the key insight. If you have 11 factorial over 8 factorial, 11 factorial is 11 times 10 times 9 times 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. And this is 8 times 7 times 6 times 5. And then all of these cancel with all of these. And you end up with 11 times 10 times 9. So that's, you want to be careful when you do algebra with your notation, and make sure you can use shortcuts when you can. So what do you need to memorize? You need to memorize what n factorial is, and you need to memorize NPR, which is n factorial over n minus r factorial. And you need to memorize NCR, which is n factorial over r factorial, n minus r factorial. Now what we haven't talked about is where we use this, and that's the subject of some following videos.